Hello everyone, I'm Lorem, and today I'm going to do a short tutorial on how to use my procedural chest generation tool. This tool is built entirely using geometry nodes in Blender, and we're not going to really go in depth on the actual node tree, but we will be going over the 42 different input variables that control how this treasure chest turns out. So this chest is super customizable and it's not too performance intensive, and we'll also be going over the shaders associated with it. So let's get started. First, I'm going to hide the chest we've already got, and then I'm going to create any new geometry. I'm just going to go with a plane. Add a geometry node modifier, and then select chest gen, and we've got our default chest. Now before anything, I'm going to set the lid rotation to be just like that so that we can see the treasure inside, and then we can start going down this list of variables. So first up, we've got the seed, and that controls the random treasure generation as well as the lock rotation, although the lock rotation is very minute. Next up, we have the X, Y, and Z resolution, which impact the overall resolution of the chest. So as we increase the X resolution, we get more on the X axis. As we increase the Y resolution, we get more on the Y axis. And as we increase it on the Z resolution, we get more on the Z axis. So next up, we've got the chest depth, width, and height, which are pretty self-explanatory. Chest depth changes how deep it is, width changes how wide it is, and height changes how tall it is. Now, chest base size influences the size of the bottom face of the chest. And if we increase the Z resolution, we can see how this curve changes with the chest base size. So we'll set this back to 2 and then move on. Alright, so now we can move on to the lid. And that starts out with square lid, which, as you probably guessed, makes the lid square. When you have square lid enabled, certain other features are turned off, such as lid triangles, lid resolution, and lid sidebands. Those three do not work when you have square lid enabled, because they change the actual properties of the cylinder that makes up the lid most of the time. So if we enable lid triangles, you can see how we have triangles here instead of just one big n-gon. And then we can change the resolution, and that just changes the resolution of the lid. Pretty easy. So next up, we've got lid sidebands, and this just changes how many bands are on the side of the lid, and this is really intended for larger chests. As you can see, we're getting some clipping. So we'll go ahead and set that back to 1. Next up, we've got lid height, which changes. I'll go ahead and set the lid rotation to 0. I forgot to cover that. You can rotate the lid. And then we have lid height, which changes the height of the lid. Pretty self-explanatory. If you set it to 0, the lid just disappears. So we can go ahead and set that back to about that. And then lid slope changes the slope of the lid, which I think is pretty cool. So you can have a rounded chest. So we'll leave it like that. I think that looks nice, and then we can keep going. Next up, we are moving on to the corners. The corners are these little cubes that are instanced on all the corners. Our first option with those is to have pillowed corners. Pillowed corners means that it's going to extrude the faces of these cubes and then scale them down a little bit. So we get this nice little pillowed effect. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. We can affect corner size, and that just affects the size of these cubes. And as a general rule, I would say always have the corner size be greater than the band size, because when you have it as less, you can see the edges of the bands. And I would say that, have them be at least the same size, if not bigger. Next up, we can address corner subdivision, which is exactly what it sounds like. It subdivides the corners. And then if we have corner subdivision, we also have the edge crease and vertex crease that goes along with that subdivision. And an edge crease changes the sharpness of the edges, and vertex crease changes the sharpness of the vertices. So we'll leave it at about there. That's nice. And then next up, we've got band size. And band size affects the size of the bands. So as you can see, we make it bigger. And then The locks and all of the fittings scale along with the band size. So if we want to have really big locks and stuff, we can set the bands to be very large. And if we want them to be really small, we can set the bands to be very small. So we can go ahead and set that at 0.65, and then we can bring the corner size up in response. So next up, we can address band resolution. Band resolution changes how many faces make up all of the bands. By default, it's set to 4, so it's square. You can have it be triangular. It looks kind of funky that way. Or you can have it be, any size you want. Just be warned that at larger sizes, you will have to make the corners larger in response. So we can go ahead and set that back to 4 and then address band subdivisions. This just changes how many times the bands are subdivided. So if you want to have smoother bands, you can up this, and if you want to have kind of rougher bands, you can lower it. And then along with those subdivisions, we have the edge crease and the vertex crease. Right now the vertex crease is pretty much maxed out, which means the vertexes are, held in position or creased. And then if we bring it down to 0, we get this nice kind of hexagonal effect. And then if we bring the edge crease up, you can see how it goes back to being completely square. So this band edge crease and band vert crease are very important for defining the profile of your bands. And if you want to have something kind of cool, I like to increase the vert crease, but not the edge crease. And it gives you this kind of fun effect. Although if you want it to be totally like square, you can just set the band edge crease to the max. Now, next up, we start to get into the more fun features, I think. Studs. So we can go ahead and enable studs, and voila, there we go. We see our studs. And then if we want more of them, we can increase the stud amount. And an important thing to note is that the studs and the fittings on the chest can overlap. So it's important to make sure that, you set it to a value where they're happy with each other. So I'll keep that at 4, and then we can move on. Actually, I'm going to change this. I'm going to make the chest a bit wider, just so that these hinges aren't kind of being encroached upon. There we go. I'm happy with that, and that looks nice. So now you can do a lot with these studs. You can change their resolution, and then if you do that, it makes them more circular, and then you can also choose to shade them smooth, which gives them a really nice, smooth look. And you can also make them larger and smaller. And so if you want a very heavily studded chest, but for it not to be spiky, you can choose to do that. You can also choose to have it be very spiky. If we set our stud resolution back to 2 and turn smooth studs off, we can look at this stud spikiness, and if we increase this, our studs get really, really spiky. I'm not actually going to keep these as spiky, but it shows you what's possible. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that down to 0. Now next up, we've got options for the other fittings. Hinges just enables and disables the hinges. And then you can also choose how many hinges you want with hinge amount. Hinge amount really comes into play more on chests that don't have a lot of Y resolution. So for instance, if we had 0 Y resolution here, but still wanted to have, a few hinges, we could increase the hinge amount accordingly. So we'll go ahead and do that, and then set hinge amount back to 0. Now we can look at clasps. If we choose to turn clasps off, you can see our clasps disappear, and then we can also re-enable them. And it's the same thing as the hinges, where we can also choose to have however many we want. I don't know why you would want 16 locks on one chest, but hey, you do you. I'll go ahead and set that back to 0, and then we can address the clasp rotation. This clasp rotation deals with the rotation of these clasp flaps. So if you want the chest to look open, you can set it so that the lid is rotated a bit and those are rotated up. And then if you want the chest to appear closed, you can, set the lid rotation to 0 and the clasp rotation to its negative limit. So this is limited by default so that it can go from, 90 degrees down to 90 degrees up. Now moving on, we've got locks. That enables and disables the locks. Pretty simple. And then handles, same thing, enables and disables handles. Treasure is again very similar. It just enables and disables the treasure. So if you just want to have an empty chest, you can just turn treasure off. And then treasure amount just influences the amount of little gold coins that are spawned. So I'll take us out of shaded view. And as you can see, it goes down and it goes up. And then gems just decides whether or not gems are spawned. And again, gem amount influences how many gems there are. So that is how you use it. Those are all of the different inputs that go into it. And now I'm going to show you guys the shaders. So let's start looking at the shaders. This is one of the first shaders of importance, chest base, and then the other one that's of importance is bands. Those are the two we're really going to be looking at. So if we want to change the color of this chest, we can just go right here to the colors node group, and then we can change these two colors. So if I wanted to make a chest that was very light, I can do that really easily. And because there's two colors here, you get kind of this nice mixture between the two. And then we can go to bands, and we see that we have a node group in here called band color. This band color affects the color of the bands texture, the fittings texture, and the handles texture. The only difference between them is the amount of like edge wear. So we can go ahead and open up this band color node group, and you see that it's just an RGB node and an output. And we can change the color of this RGB node, and it changes the color of our bands. So you can make this, whatever you want. I tend to stick with kind of yellows and grays, but whatever you want to do. So that is my chest tool. I hope you enjoy it. You can find it on my Gumroad, and hope you give it a shot. Thank you very much.